I want to welcome the GMs and the wives, the godly men and the warm, inviting, feminine, empathetic women out there. It was a long day today, and so I'm just barely now filming this video here. It's the latest I've actually ever filmed the video. But I was thinking about how I'd actually never posted a video on my testimony, and I wanted to share that with you all today. And so I titled this video, Died to be Born Again. And that's really what I had to do. I had to die to the falsehoods to be born again into the truth. And I was someone that was looking everywhere but Jesus. I was looking anywhere you could possibly look, but I had never truly looked to Jesus, and I did read the Bible for quite some time. To give you guys a little bit more background about just who I was and how I came to Jesus, I was an atheist for most of my life. I never really believed in any God. Didn't really have a reason to be honest. There was no reason to believe in God as far as I could tell. And I thought, well, if there's no reason to have faith, then why have faith? And I later got that question answered, but for most of my life, it was that question that really stumbled me a lot of the times. And so I never really figured out why to have faith. And I was like this up until my early 20s. I'm 27 now, and when I was 22, I had a dream where I saw these bubbles of time. And I've talked a little bit about this stuff before. Like everything that I'm going to be covering, I've maybe hinted at or have talked a little bit about already, but this is going to be the full gist of it in this video. So I had a dream where I saw bubbles of time, and in each bubble of time, I could peer into the bubble and live a life within a bubble. And it was almost like each of these bubbles of time were its own collective consciousness in a part of the greater consciousness altogether. And when I woke up, I had these really bizarre feelings in my third eye, my heart, and then my solar plexus. And I had heard about chakras before, but I never really believed in them. And all of a sudden, these three spots of mine were just burning. It was just a burning. It was very purifying, though. And this dream was, again, when I was 22 years old. And it was just this burning passion of love that I could just feel. And it was hurting, but it was hurting in a good way. It was very painful, but in a good way. It was like all of the bad and negativity was being just completely destroyed. And so I woke up and I got out of my bed, and this stuff happened, like that feeling happened and went on for about 10 to 20 seconds. And I went to look in the mirror, and it was as if I was seeing my soul for the first time. I never really saw the human being that was in the mirror. I never saw the human being that was there until this time. And it was almost like I was seeing myself in the third person, but also not seeing myself in the third person. It was a very strange, peculiar feeling of self-awareness that I had never really experienced before, never heard of anybody else experiencing. And again, I was never really someone to really value anything that has to do with chakras. But I can tell you for a fact that I felt that. I felt that for sure. And some might call that a Kundalini awakening. But I think it would be a mistake to call it that necessarily. And the reason being was because it was more of a step on the path that I needed to take to get closer to Jesus. So you fast forward a few years later, and I'm about 24, 25 at this point. And I was just going through a phase where I had done so much spiritual depths and understandings of myself. I had continued to practice meditation. I'd continued to read the Bible, even though I wasn't really like, I didn't have that close connection to Jesus that I do now when I read the Bible. I didn't have that close connection, but I did value what it had to say. I did value the Bible, and I did value just the stories in general. I thought that it was very important to history, and it was about this time when I started to realize that, maybe it's actually logical to have faith in Jesus. And that was never really something that I thought about before. And the reason being was because all of the chakra stuff, as helpful as it was for me, it wasn't really getting me closer to myself. Like, it was helpful, and it was a utility that I still use to this day. And a lot of Christians may say that the chakras or whatever are not necessarily, godly. And I disagree, because what I genuinely believe the chakras to be are nerve endings that are, what would you say? They're nerve endings that are collectively combined in certain places in the body that hold certain amounts of possibilities for brain activity. And so these are like concentrated nerve endings as far as I can tell within my body. And so it was about this time that I started to think more about Jesus, and I had gotten COVID. I'd got COVID, and I don't know what really led me to think about Jesus during COVID, but it was right during Christmas time. I suppose maybe that was what it was. And I was 25 at the time, and I knew the destination that I had in mind. I knew the destination, but I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know how to get to the place in which I really wanted to go, but I still knew that there was something missing. Like, something was missing. I wasn't quite on the path that I wanted to be. And so I started to research more into Jesus. And if anybody doesn't know, I started to watch and listen to Jonathan Pajau, I think is how you pronounce his name. Jordan Peterson had recommended him in videos a long time ago, and I don't know why, but I was like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. I'm going to check this guy out, because I really liked his artwork. He had beautiful artwork, biblical artwork. And for some reason, seeing his artwork really inspired me. And it really made me feel like, wow, maybe there's something more to Jesus. No, I can't. No. And I just basically denied Jesus, even though the truth was staring me in the face. It's like, this is what you need. And I was drawn to research Jesus more, and I was drawn to learn more about these things. And then I had a dream where I was with Jesus in the forest, and there were 7 balls of fire, like floating in the forest. And Jesus came to me, and he was wearing this beautiful white robe. I mean, he was just the most elegant looking person I'd ever seen in the dream, and anywhere really. But he told me that Jesus was called the Son of God, and that you must ground yourself in the Father. And when he said that, the flames, like, they shot into the ground. And it was as if those flames, those 7 flames, represented the chakras. Well, I started to do some research in the Bible, And I was like, man, why would Jesus show me this? Like, and I did feel closer to Jesus, and this is when I really started to actually pick up my cross, so to speak. But I had to let all of these things that I've been told about Christianity and the Eastern religions, I had to let all of that go and only trust what I've experienced. That was the key factor. I had to only trust what I experienced, and I had to only trust my intuition, which was very challenging because it's like you have to put a lot of faith in trusting that you were experiencing what you actually were experiencing. Like, for someone like myself that was constantly gaslit growing up and that was a people pleaser for a long time and that really always put others before myself, I did not have myself at my mental point of origin in the way that I do now. It was very, very difficult to actually trust some of my experiences. I remember when I was dealing with a narcissist at one time, I had to actually write down conversations that we had when I was, in my early 20s, because he would gaslight me later on and said, "Oh, I never said that." And I was like, "Yeah, you did. You said that literally 5 minutes ago." "Oh, no, I didn't." What? Just crazy making stuff, right? And so I started to catch on after a while, and I was like, okay, there's no way this guy is actually not saying these things. I'm going to write this down. So after every conversation that we had at one point for like a week or two, I wrote it down. I wrote down the conversations because I wanted to know if, like, was I going crazy? Am I losing my mind here? And anytime I really have to ask myself that, I always allow myself to entertain it. Because it's like, okay, yeah, maybe I am going crazy. Let's entertain this. Let's entertain the possibility. Okay, let's say that I am. Now let's take a philosophical hammer, as Friedrich Nietzsche would say, and let's start hammering away at why that would be incorrect. And usually that's the best approach that I found for myself to whenever I had to ask myself that question. I would take that philosophical hammer because philosophy was my background and philosophy is what I graduated in college. And so after I have this dream with Jesus, and after I go through all of these things, I realize that I have to really trust myself. And that was one of the most terrifying things to do because that meant that I also had to accept myself unconditionally. Everything about me, even the parts of me that I really did not like. I had to literally accept it unconditionally and not treat it as a threat or anything terrible about, like, even the terrible stuff about myself, I had to not treat as terrible. Like, I could see it and I could recognize, yep, that's something to work on. That was more the mentality, more so than that's terrible. So I had to die to all of these concepts and mindsets. I had to die to these things. And when I finally did, it was as if Jesus brought life into me. I remember I just woke up from the dream. And it was as if Jesus was breathing life into me. And I felt all of the pain of my ancestors. I felt all of the pain of emotionally and physically of everyone in my lineage. And everything that I would have to go through in this life all at once. It was as if time completely was erased for a brief moment, but that one moment was enough to change the universe. I experienced a kind of timelessness that and I'm not going to say that it's enlightenment because I think to claim enlightenment would be to misunderstand what enlightenment is. And I'm not going to sit here and say that, how holier than thou I am. That's not who I am. This is more of just of what I experienced and just my testimony of Jesus altogether. And so I felt in this one moment, this timelessness, this pure love for everything and everyone. And it was as if the whole universe was like a substance that you could neither take or get from. It was just pure energy, and whatever you put into it is what you got out of it. And I never really understood that up until that moment. That was when I realized, like, okay, this whole universe is more magical than I could have ever possibly imagined. It's a miracle to be here. It's a miracle to even experience something. Like, to think about how there really is something rather than nothing. That's amazing. That's amazing. And for the next 2 weeks after that, I remember I went to my sanctuary place. I have a place here in my town that I'm living in. It's only about 10 minutes away from my house. And then you'll be in the mountains and you'll be walking by a river, and there's a small lake area. And I remember going there later that day, and I just called it my sanctuary because that's where I had some of the most enlightening moments of my life, and just that's my place of peace. I remember going there, and I could envision myself picking up my cross and following Jesus. And I could see it in my head, and I could feel it. And it was snowing at the time. It was only like a week or two after Christmas, and it was snowing at the time. And it was just this unbelievable sense of clarity. Like, you guys have ever been on a hike, right? And you get to the top, and you don't realize the view of everything until you get to the top, right? That's the kind of feeling that it was. And when you're at the top of the mountain, it's not necessarily like you're better or worse than anybody else. It's just a different perspective, right? That was what it felt like when I really accepted Jesus into my life. And when I really accepted that Jesus saved me. Not only I didn't find Jesus, Jesus found me, and he saved me. It was as if he was really saying to me, do you want to be healed? Because I can heal your spirit. And that was just amazing. It was just amazing. And I remember hearing the first time I heard Jesus' voice. And this was the voice of the Holy Spirit, really. But it wasn't like a voice like I was going crazy and there was this random voice that I was hearing. No, this was something that was not me. It was something greater. It was not my conscience either, because everybody kind of has the understanding of what their conscience is, even if they think that they don't have it. They understand like whether or not they should be doing something or they shouldn't be doing something. You have a conscience. But this was something else, and Socrates would call it the daemon. And it's not a demon, it's a daemon. It's someone that you consult with. And it never told Socrates what to do. It only told him what not to do. And I thought that was very interesting, because this was the same kind of voice that was talking to me, and still to this day. If I really need an answer or a question, I consult the Holy Spirit. And so what I think Socrates was describing as the daemon is actually the Holy Spirit. Now, I understand that could be a big claim for all of the philosophers and the all of these scholars out there. But I think we need to look at this from a spiritual perspective more so than a philosophical or psychological perspective. My hope with this testimony is to actually bridge all of those together. That's one of the reasons why I still incorporate the chakras into my practice of meditations today, to this day. And anybody that's done consultations with me knows that I reference them because I can feel the chakra energy, so to speak. And the more I researched in the Bible, the more I begin to realize that the chakras are actually a mere reflection of the 7 fruits of the Holy Spirit. And I actually had another dream a few months later where I was on a bridge, and there was the Eastern philosophies on one side and there was the Western philosophies on the other. And God told me that I was to be the bridge. I was the one to help build the bridge to all of these different kinds of cultural backgrounds and religious ideas, etc. Because I'm someone that is capable of taking a little bit from everywhere. And in John 4:24, which I've referenced on this channel before, it says that God is spirit and truth, and those that worship God worship in spirit and truth. So as long as you've got spirit, and as long as you've got the truth, you're there. And I know for a fact that I had those experiences with what some would call the Kundalini energy. And I had multiple kinds of experiences throughout the last few years. Multiple times. There were times where there were some experiences that are better left unshared, but they were some of the most profound experiences of my life. And this one I will share was one time I was sleeping, and it was almost like there was this lava of like hot snakes being poured on my spine, and the lava was starting from my tailbone, my root chakra, you could say, and going up to my crown. And it was all along my spine, and I could feel like these hot snakes, like these slithering but they were wise. They were like these wise snakes. And it was very interesting. It was very challenging to accept what was going on because it was so painful, but it was, again, every time almost anything had to do with the Kundalini experience, you could say. I don't like using that term because I need to come up with the actual term for that. I'll have to meditate and think about that because I want it to be a proper term. I want it to be something that can actually be applicable for anybody that has these kinds of experiences. But I genuinely believe that in many ways, my purpose is to revolutionize the way we think about spirituality and psychology altogether, because in many ways they're one and the same thing. In many ways they are. And I also think that I'm meant to revolutionize how we think about culture and religion. Culture and religion are also linked and closely linked at that. Very discreetly and yet also overtly. And this is what makes religious ideas, I think, so captivating. And so I know that based off of everything that happened up until that moment where I really started to follow Jesus, and for those 2 weeks after that I started to actually pick up my cross, it was as if I was hearing the angels singing in the monasteries. I was hearing the angels sing to me when I was in this deep state, and I was just obsessed with reading the Bible. I was reading the Bible for hours a day because I finally understood the deeper meaning of the Bible. Like, oh my gosh, the Bible isn't just a book. It's not just a document. It's a living document. Because what is spirit and truth? It's liveliness. It's everlasting life, which is what Jesus promises us when we are saved and born again by the Holy Spirit. It's a beautiful thing to reflect and to see these parts of my life and how I got to this point. And ultimately, the joy that I've been able to feel and the insight that I've been able to receive only by the grace of God, because that's really the only way that I've ever been able to get anything of actual substance and anything real. It was by the grace of God. I have a will. It's not to say that I don't have a will. It's not to say that you don't have a will. But it's to say that we all ultimately are going to, if we truly are following Jesus, we're going to need to learn how to submit to his will. I can want certain things. I can desire certain things. But is it in his will? Well, that's where becoming obedient comes into play. And I didn't want to do a YouTube channel for a while. But there were months and months where I didn't want to do the YouTube channel. And so now here I am 2.5 years later after following Jesus now, nearly, and it was about half a year after I started following Jesus is when I started to make videos. But I was only making like one video a month or every 2 months. And then finally in October of 2022, I began to really make videos nonstop. And when I first started to follow Jesus, I didn't just flip a switch. I still had certain sins that I was working on and that I was getting rid of. One of them being smoking Mary Jane, hanging out with Mary Jane. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And I haven't even touched anything to do with marijuana in nearly 2 years now. And I just haven't felt the desire for it. And within the last year and a half, I've had 2 glasses of wine. I cook with wine every now and again, but the alcohol dissolves after a while if it's cooked properly. So I don't really count that because I'm not actually drinking alcohol. And the alcohol gets burned away. So anyway, but I like the flavor within certain kinds of meals that I have. And so there were other things that changed. I didn't get on semen retention until April. So that was 4 months of 2022 when I really started to try semen retention. I didn't even really know what I was doing exactly. God was just leading me to it for those few months. But prior to that, I didn't really know what it was called. I just knew that watching porn was not the way to go. And I hadn't watched porn. I almost said it. Almost said it. I haven't watched porn since October of 2021. And that was the last time. And so that was 2 months before I started to follow Jesus. And I was just I remember watching, again, it was that watching myself watch myself. And I saw, I just saw someone weird. I was just man, why are you watching people do it? You weirdo, man. freaking weirdo. And I just thought to myself, yeah, you know what? It is kind of weird though to watch somebody else and somebody else just go at it. That's kind of weird. And so I stopped it at that point. But and I probably only like played with myself like once a week or once every 2 weeks up until April of 2022. So like 6 months it took me to get rid of that sin altogether. And then I went like 3 weeks on semen retention the first time. And then I intentionally just, I played with myself because I wanted to see the benefits. I felt the worst I had ever experienced in my life. I felt so terrible. I felt just so horrendous about everything going on that I didn't even want to ever think about playing with myself or watching porn ever again. And I haven't looked back. And so when I started to actually do YouTube videos in October of 2022, and I pretty much have done a YouTube video almost every day since, God was calling me to do this. I didn't want to do it, but I kept having random people. I kept having these like random people ask me if I'm the guy with the YouTube channel. And at the time I was like, no. No. And I'd never see these people again. Still to this day, I've never seen them again. But they were just randomly for like 2 or 3 months from like May of 2022 to like September of 2022. There were quite a few times, not over a dozen, but closer to a dozen than not. Then I was like, I had these people just asking me if I'm the guy with the YouTube channel. And I thought, no, I'm not. Even though I'd already made a few videos by then, I was just, no, I'm not. I'm not that guy. I didn't want to be putting my life on public display. I didn't want to. I was a very introverted person. I considered myself to be anyway. And I didn't think, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I actually didn't want to just do it. I didn't want to actually commit to it. And so even though I knew I had this calling of sorts, I didn't want to commit to the calling. And I had these struggles along the way up until like October of 2022. And that was when everything really started to sink into myself a bit more. Because at that point I had been trying to actually follow Jesus for 10 months. And I'd gotten rid of all these sins. I'd gotten rid of almost everything negative in my life at that point. I had completely transformed. Like I was already a different person in January of 2022, like the first month that I was following Jesus. But, and I had a lot of growth prior to that. And I had learned how to let go of people, and I learned a lot. Okay. I learned a lot, but it was as if when I started to really follow Jesus, everything magnetized in my ascension process. It was just like full speed ahead, and I haven't slowed down since. Stopped down, slowed down, pretty much the same thing. I haven't taken pretty much a day off in 1.5 to 2 years now. I don't even remember the last time I took a day off, like actually taking a day off. And there are going to be days of work where I'm not doing nearly as much. I'm doing like 6 hours or maybe even just 5 hours of work. But the days that I'm hardcore, which is probably about 6 days a week, I'm working anywhere between 10 to 14 hour days. And the reason being is because I know that I had to die to get this life, and I will not take it for granted. And I'm going to create something that I can leave a lasting legacy. I'm going to create a family. I'm going to create a relationship with a woman that is a warm, inviting, feminine, empathetic woman, I will create that. I will create a way for my family to, down the line, value family legacy over family leisure. I will down the line. And this is something else. Will is very important, especially for a man. A man wills, a woman is willing. That's the difference. And so I had to learn how to have a will, because I didn't have a backbone. I didn't have a will for a long time. And even though I had grown a lot up until I started to follow Jesus, it wasn't until I followed Jesus where I felt like my whole being could be solidified. And, there's a lot of precious things that I've done, like little pieces of artwork or things like, I don't want to show everybody here what I'm always doing behind the scenes, because a lot of my artwork is just for God. It's just for praising God, and that's how my creativity comes from the source of creation. And so that's one of the ways that I worship God, is through creation. And it's just been a beautiful ride since then. I mean, if it weren't for semen retention and actually valuing my physical, emotional, and spiritual health by grounding myself in Jesus, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't be the person that I am now at all. In fact, I'm not the same person. I used to go by Tad. Even saying that kind of makes me laugh. For those of you that know that I'm Thaddeus, that's my full name. I used to be called by Tad. And I started going by Thaddeus really when I started to follow Jesus, because Jesus called me Thaddeus in one of my prayers and meditations. He told me that I'm Thaddeus, I'm not Tad. And that was a big moment for me, because I didn't have an identity for so long. I didn't have an understanding of who I was and what I was about. And to finally know who I was and have God, to have God say your name in a prayer, that was something I never thought I would experience anything like that. Never thought I would experience anything like that. Because I've had meditations up until I followed Jesus. I've had active imaginations. I've had imagery meditations where I could go on and on about that kind of stuff. But to hear God say your name, it was as if I literally was born again in that moment in many ways. And I'm very, very grateful for that. And I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to just tell my story, and to have anybody that's made it this far in the video, thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for hopefully just having something to learn about in this video here. And hopefully you got some certain insights or perspectives that maybe you haven't gotten before. This is ultimately what God does. Sometimes God will give you more questions than answers. But sometimes the question is the answer. That's like the book of Jonah, for example, when Jonah has to go into the whale, right? And when Jonah comes back. I hope I'm thinking of the right story. Anyway, the book of Jonah ends with a question. And that was something that was interesting to me, because I thought, a question is an answer from God's perspective. The world is so paradoxical. Like, the universe is paradoxical. Life is very paradoxical if you really think about it. You've got to not care to have people care. You've got to be able to have abundance you got to be able to value your time and be scarce with your time to have abundance. Like, there's so many different dichotomies and juxtapositions in life that don't make sense, but excuse me, but actually make sense in the long run. But anyways, guys, I hope this video was useful and helpful in some way, shape, or form. But I just wanted to share my testimony because I felt as though it was just the right thing to do at this time. And peace be with you till next time.